I don't know if you want to start. Great. We did get permission from Bob to record this. So, and it looks like there's a way that NAPS is going to start hopefully having these recordings available in the future at some point. So we look forward to that. I'm Debbie Deem and Steve Baker here, and I'm going to let Steve kind of take over the show, but we would appreciate you again putting your name in, the location you're in, the city and state, and what your agency is, and starting out on this. And we will be sharing a resource list throughout a few times. So welcome aboard, and I'm going to turn it over to Steve.
Okay, we're very welcome today to have Bob Sullivan with us. He's a veteran journalist and author of 5 books, including a New York Times bestseller. And he spent nearly 2 decades at MSNBC and NBC News, still appears on Today Show, NBC Nightly News, and CNBC. He's now a syndicated columnist and frequent TV guest. He also hosts AARP's The Perfect Scam podcast, which is really good if you haven't listened to it. Often have issues relevant to this group. He also is co-host of a podcast called Breach, which examines the history's biggest hacking stories, and he's co-host of the podcast So Bob, which tackles stories about unintended consequences of technology. He has a Substack and reports on consumer protection issues. So he's been doing this stuff a long time, and one of the issues he's really been out in front of is fraud where crooks get payment through the Zelle app. And so we were hoping today that Bob would talk a little bit about how that works, what's the regulatory structure, what's the future in it. And Bob, thank you very much. Great to have you on board.
Sure. Thanks so much for being here. And thank you all the folks who are in the room for the work that you do. As I saw all your titles fly by, it really, I honor all the effort. And, you know, there aren't a lot of folks who take this line of work and all the caring that you have to do for people. So I really appreciate that. Steve is a regular guest on the Perfect Scam podcast. So if you listen to that, you'll get to hear him. And I see Dr. Pratkanis here too. I've interviewed him a couple of times. So I really am proud of the work that we do there. About Zelle. So I've been writing about what I call my beat is broken technology. So technology that does unexpected things. Computer hacking, virus writing, privacy, those sorts of things. And money systems fall into that. So I've been writing about the advent of new money systems since the 90s. And I've seen the same pattern over and over again. When PayPal came out, when all the P2P apps came out like Venmo. I mean, and this is true with the whole tech sector, except it's playing with fire when you do it with money. Companies come up with an idea, they just grab as much market share as they can. Crime and all those other associated issues be damned. And when you deal with money, criminals figure this out very, very quickly. And with each successive one of these new money systems, they've had to, really reel in their systems and add some friction in order to make it less easy for criminals. The problem with Zelle, and Zelle is a really big problem. I started seeing emails from victims about 5 years ago, and the emails were just absolutely shocking. It was something along the lines of, I've never heard of Zelle. And all of a sudden, $15,000 is missing from my Bank of America account. How could this possibly be? And worse yet, when I call up Bank of America, they say, sorry, there's no refunds with the Zelle. Zelle isn't like a debit card or a credit card, so you're out of luck. I did umpteen stories where I had to call Bank of America or any other large bank and explain to their PR department that yes, these kinds of transactions actually are covered by Regulation E. I'm getting a little ahead of myself in the story. But this is one of those consumer stories that the first few times you hear about it, I think you don't believe it because you're like, Bob's probably exaggerating. That can't be true. Somebody can't suddenly have their account drained using a tool that they've never heard of, and the bank doesn't care. Like, that's outlandish, but it is true. I'm here to tell you, I interviewed many, many people about that. So many. And then once I started writing about it, I just started getting absolutely torpedoed with email from other victims around the country. It's one of those things, when you're a reporter, you get a sense pretty quickly that you're onto something. When 1 or 2 stories suddenly solicit a whole bunch of feedback. So I actually had to create an FAQ page just because so many people were landing on my website, desperate to figure out, first of all, what is Zelle? And then, what should they do? How do they know what their rights are? But a really enormous part of the Zelle problem is that And I'm quoting from the very first set of TV ads that came out when Zelle was launched. It's backed by the big banks, so you know it's secure. So when Zelle came out, the banks were blindsided by all of these other P2P apps, and they were losing all of the kids who were paying each other $20 for lunch over Venmo or Cash App or whatnot. And they realized they needed a piece of the action. So a set of essentially all the large banks, but there's a consortium of 7 banks, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, all the characters you would expect, who own this company called Early Warning, which was adapted to maintain the Zelle network. And the problem is, Zelle drafts off of the reputation of these large financial institutions. And so a lot of consumers are still confused about what their rights are when it comes to a Zelle transaction. Too many consumers using Zelle can feel like you're using an electronic payment account associated with your checking account, for example. And in fact, many banks go to great pains when you log on to your online banking to put Zelle there, so it can feel like it's as safe as these other kinds of transactions. And it is in no way, shape, or form as safe as that. Zelle is just like handing someone a $20 bill, only you can move thousands of dollars of bills 12,000 miles away instantly, and you have no right to dispute the transaction. So there's a couple of different kinds of Zelle fraud, and I'll just go over these quickly. It's just, many of you probably know this, and I apologize, but just to make sure all the knowledge is on the table. There are unauthorized transactions associated with Zelle. An unauthorized transaction would be what I described earlier. So somebody hacks into, say, your online bank account, and they use Zelle to send themselves money, where they find some other way to access what should be your Zelle account, and they move themselves the money. That's an unauthorized transaction, and it is indeed covered by Regulation E. There's no dispute about that. Early Warning says that directly, and so do all the federal regulators. So when something like that happens, and the consumer calls the bank should essentially instantly refund the money the way that they do with, say, a debit card fraudulent transaction. That is happening more now. At the beginning of Zelle time 5 years ago, it often didn't happen. And that's because of the second kind of fraud, which is when the consumer willingly sends the money. Say they're on Craigslist and they see an offer for concert tickets, and they Zelle $200 to someone they haven't met, and then the concert tickets never show up. That's fraud. But because the consumer authorized the transaction, they push the red button to send the money, they're not entitled to any kind of protection. So that's the same thing as standing outside a concert venue, handing someone $200 and having them run away. So the banks are on fairly solid ground there. So there's these unauthorized transactions, which absolutely should be covered by Reg E, and there's authorized transactions, which might involve fraud, but there's no coverage there. So that part's relatively clear, although many consumers, when they're paying with fraud, again, associate the halo effect and the security that they have with their traditional bank. So I think for a lot of consumers, this is still confusing, and the banks could do a much better job of making that clear to consumers. However, that's not actually the most current problem. The most current problem would be this third category of transactions, and it fits pretty much neatly in the middle of the two things that I just described. So it would be, and you probably have seen lots of stories like this because they have swept the local television over the last 6 months. Somebody gets a text message or a call. That call claims to be from Bank of America, and it says, you are in the middle of having your account drained, but don't worry, I'm with the security department. We're here to help you. But what you have to do is move your money from one Zelle account to another Zelle account, and then you'll be safe. But the caller is actually a criminal, and the consumer is moving their money into an account that the criminal controls. So banks have steadfastly maintained that that is an authorized transaction because the consumer has been manipulated into pushing the red button to send the money. There are plenty of people, I think I would count present company among them, who would argue pretty convincingly that is not an authorized transaction because the consumer has done it under false pretenses, and that transaction should be covered by Regulation E. Unfortunately, there is just not yet clarity on that point. And so when consumers call their banks, the frontline workers at the banks have been instructed to say no to everything, which is another really important point I want to stress to all of you. This might be the most, if you only remember one thing I have to tell you, there is a lot of fraud on Zelle. A lot of the fraud is the Craigslist type, where consumers are not entitled to any kind of dispute resolution. It's my firm opinion, and I have not received an internal document or anything, but just my experience in all of my email has told me that banks have essentially told everyone to reject every Zelle dispute, and or they do terrible job of training even their fraud investigators. So they're overwhelmed with these calls about Zelle. They just say no, 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 even when it's absolutely clear the consumer is entitled to a refund. I'm certain this has been happening. And so, the first thing on my FAQ page is don't take no for an answer. Keep calling back, keep calling back. Many consumers have luck third, fourth, fifth try. Many consumers have luck when they finally get a local journalist or me to write their story up. In almost all cases, when that happens, the banks cave in and refund the money. Although I will say, there's been some really, Stacey Crowley at the New York Times has done some great reporting on this in the last year or so. And her and I have talked on background, and there are more cases where banks are even in the face of a New York Times story, are not refunding consumers. And that actually is a kind of a scary warning sign to me, because I think that means there is even more fraud than I imagine at Zelle. And they're very, very worried about one day the class action lawsuit, attorney general action, whatnot. That like they don't want to create enough precedent that they're going to have to refund. I shouldn't hazard a guess, but I'm sure it's hundreds of thousands, probably more, of victims through the past 5 years who they said no to, who they will one day have to say yes to in some settlement. And so the more that they concede today, the easier it will be for a lawyer in the future to wring a large settlement out of them. And so the takeaway from that is no matter what the circumstances of the Zelle fraud, it's really important that consumers complain to their attorney general, complain to the CFPB, and create a paper trail, because I am quite convinced that at some point, X to 5 years from now, there's going to be a legal action that entitles them to something if they have the right paperwork in hand. And so that's my overview of where Zelle is right now. Why don't I pause right there and see if there's any questions about that?
I've got one real quick one, Bob. Could you tell us more about Regulation E?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. So when you use a credit card, I mean, this is all at this point now pretty much part of the lexicon of America. When you use a credit card, if there's fraud, you don't have to pay. And there's a set of Federal Reserve regulations, Regulation CC, that governs credit card transactions. Very similar consumer dispute protections extend to electronic transactions that either are the result of an ATM card or an online payment or a debit payment. All those checking account related payments fit under the large category of Regulation E, which governs virtually all electronic transactions that consumers engage in. And there's various levels of consumer liability limitation, but for all intents and purposes, same thing as credit cards. You don't have to pay if you dispute the charge within a reasonable amount of time. Consumers are it's so ingrained in consumers now that when they pull out a piece of plastic, and we don't even pull out pieces of plastic anymore, right? We autofill forms on Google to pay, that we're entitled to this kind of protection. So when a Zelle transaction is mixed in, it can feel like it has the same sort of protections. And that's one of my concerns here.
Well, it seems to me that some of the other, I was wondering how this sets it apart from Venmo or Cash App, where they interpret Reg E differently. It seems to me that some of them do, because I know they've struggled with this in particularly credit card world, on what do you do about counterfeit products, where people did place an order, but there's fraud and inducement of the contract, and so people are out. So are you seeing the same sort of activity with Cash App or Venmo or other payment apps? Or?
I'm shocked to hear myself say, Venmo's more trustworthy than Zelle at this point. And it's the same, I swear, the learning curve, it's almost like I could plot it on a chart, right? After so many years of your service becoming overrun by criminals committing fraud, you realize you have to deal with it. So Venmo's actually hired people to fix it. And Venmo has this special offering now where you can pay a little extra and actually be entitled to a guarantee. I know a lot less about Cash App, frankly, about the mechanics of Cash App. But
I think PayPal has a similar kind of thing where if
Yeah.
you're dealing with somebody that's not a friend or something, you pay it kind of a different, it's a different level of protection.
yeah, and PayPal is like they were sooner, right? So I think they're further along this curve. I find PayPal at this point now, and I wrote so many negative PayPal stories 15 years ago, I couldn't count. PayPal is a fairly mature money service at this point. But I don't want to run past the other point you made, Steve, which is really important, which is if you buy a counterfeit product and you bought it with Zelle, you're not entitled to anything. And that's really important for consumers to understand. And of course, on the other side of this, if you're a criminal, Zelle is great because you don't have to deal with any complexities. There are green shoots. I think there was after the most recent Stacey Crowley story, the U.S. Senate got involved. Elizabeth Warren recently held a hearing where she actually embarrassed a lot of company executives. And out of that hearing came some statistics about how much fraud was occurring, which was good, because now we know some of the things I'm speculating are real. And there's indication that they're going to add some pretty dramatic steps, including they're just going to close Zelle accounts that are associated with any fraud, which seems like an obvious step, but better late than never. And it should perhaps for the first time put up some kind of a roadblock on the other side of the transaction, because they've made it really, really easy for criminals to use Zelle and to get the money and to run away with it.
So the Senate hearings are interesting. So do you think, obviously Senator Warren was one of the people that suggested the CFPB. I'm sure she still has tons of influence there, and one would think that she would encourage them to do more with it. So what happened to the Senate hearings, and how is she coming at this?
I mean, honestly, so it was a broad hearing. It wasn't just about Zelle, but she used her 5 minutes to highlight Zelle, which I thought was great. And basically what she used it for was to harangue them into answering the question about how much fraud there was. She had sent a demand letter to them some 6 months earlier, I think, and they had all ignored it. So the week after, we got some data, which was positive. But as for the hard result out of that, there isn't one. I am also surprised the CFPB has not been more clear on this issue. They did issue an FAQ making clear what I said earlier, which is that Zelle is covered by Reg E when there's unauthorized transactions. Even that was there was a layer of vagueness around that. But as far as this, when a consumer conducts a transaction under false pretenses and whether or not that should be covered in any way, the CFPB has not issued a ruling on that yet.
Well, this money that's being stolen, these Zelle things, has to go into another bank account, I presume. That somebody has opened, and they should be able to trace those, or at least look for patterns. Do you have any sense of whether anybody in law enforcement has tried to look for commonalities and who's receiving the money and what's happening to those accounts?
I don't, and not that I would know if they were in the middle of a case, right? But I certainly would love one day to hear that a international crime ring that exclusively used Zelle to move money had been arrested and a bunch of accounts frozen. I don't know of any case like that.
I haven't seen any either, and you would think they would, at least if they're having money mules, in other words, other victims that are kind of opening the accounts and getting a cut of the money, that you would, but you would have heard, but I haven't heard of anybody being arrested, any real law enforcement actions about it.
I mean, I would like to jump in on that point. So the Perfect Scam, this podcast that I host, I mean, we pride ourselves on really highlighting the story of the victims in these stories. When you hear about someone having $100,000 stolen from them, it kind of goes in one ear and out the other. And so we try to really humanize the stories. But in the end, all of these things are elaborate cover stories for what used to be a wire transfer, and most currently is probably a set of gift card purchases. And On the horizon is the move from gift cards to Zelle, and then beyond that, sort of simultaneously is crypto, right? So the criminals will just move money in whatever is the easiest way possible. My sense is that there's still more volume in the gift card technique right now than anywhere else. And I mean, hopefully, I mean, AARP and others are doing a lot to try to stop the gift card dance. But then, of course, they'll just move to wherever the least friction is.
Well, I actually saw recently that the FTC complaints, victim money being lost through crypto recently edged out gift cards.
That's right. I remember that too. Yeah,
But-
I think that has to do with the size of the thefts. You know, I mean, gift cards still require a lot of mechanical tactics, right? Cryptocurrency, the sky's the limit. So
Well,
Like you said, I think they start out with probably gift cards and then can move to crypto once they get them, manipulated them and kind of, you know, have them groomed and, you know, ready to follow whatever they say. So that's,
And,
I guess.
it's interesting, I saw that the banks are saying that only 1% of their transactions are fraudulent, but we used to hear the exact same thing from Western Union and MoneyGram in the old
Right.
days. And I remember telling them, I said, okay, so if I ran a small storefront business and of every 100 people that came into the parking lot, one was getting mugged, I would have a really pretty serious concern about this. But
Yeah,
you know,
and not only that, Steve, but this is something that I like we've come to accept, which is just shocking to me. If there was a mall nearby and every day there was a mugging at the mall couldn't get away with existing like that. They would have to pay for more security. My biggest criticism of all these businesses is that they allow this crime to happen because if they didn't, their business wouldn't scale. They couldn't afford to open a mall that was this unsafe, but they can afford to do it online because we sort of look the other way at these kinds of crimes. I don't want to, by the way, I can see only some of the text messages going by because of the way that I'm connected to this meeting, but I saw Kathy write, and I want to highlight this. Yes, everyone should be filing a police report, and that's a big pain in the behind. But we need to have the data, we need to have the numbers to show how bad this is. And also, you know, that's the way you get the attention of a local detective, is if he can pull a string and find out there's 100 cases related to something instead of 2 or 3. So whenever you're interacting with somebody in this situation, make sure they get a police report.
and actually Kathy had another comment. Kathy, I don't know if you want to open yourself up and talk about that, what you said about Venmo.
Yeah, sure. I was just saying that I had seen the same thing with Venmo, that they're actually on their website, they're talking about this sort of premium version that will protect you in a business transaction. But I don't think it's launched yet. But I checked Cash App and I'm not seeing anything in that space. And in fact, Cash App is probably the one we hear more about when there's a problem and the person needs to reach out to Cash App and they can't find a number anywhere. So they Google it and they're getting right in touch with the criminal because the criminal has bought the ad for the Cash App customer service number, which is also an issue with so many other companies being their brands being stolen in that way. But so there's just other angles to the problem.
Yeah, including Google got money for that ad.
yeah, that posting phone number stuff is also an issue for leading people to tech support scams. And that
Mhm.
happens an awful lot.
And I just want to mention in regards to John brought up that police may be limited, especially in more rural areas or, you know, when they're just overwhelmed with other kinds of crimes. But I think that's important, especially if there's someone that is law enforcement on this page, that they can also, any sworn law enforcement official can access the Internet Crime Complaint Center as well as the information on FTC. So if even just getting that information into those larger databases, I kind of harp on that every meeting, but it's so critical to help make that bigger report. So if the police can only do that, you know, or ensure that the victim or someone in the family files that bigger report, it's still important. And it's still important that patrol knows to do that and all as well.
I want to make a point there on that too. police make the assumption that they can't go after this crime, so they don't do anything. And I understand that. And you don't prioritize it because you're going to prioritize violence and property crimes, something we need to change. But if you don't investigate, you don't know what you don't know. So we're working on at AARP a continuing education program for law enforcement, for prosecutors, anybody else in that space, to help them understand that these are crimes. The police should at least take the report, if not try to investigate. And prosecutors and police can work together to make really good cases to go after these guys, because a lot of them, most of them are going to have people in the United States. And if we can get to them, maybe we tear it down. It's a start anyway.
Right.
Especially with the money mules is the way to go. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and the one thing, I went through the Better Business Bureau's complaint database for victims who'd lost money from Zelle several months ago. And what I found is they were almost all went back to scams out of Cameroon, the pet scams, people advertising illegal drugs for sale online, people advertising firearms for sale, and they ask you to pay for Zelle, and of course nobody ever gets the money. And so that's what Zelle was. But if it was Zelle, it would seem to me that you've got to have somebody open a bank account in the United States, which means that what we found with pet scams of the Western Union MoneyGram was that there were Cameroonian students who come to the United States on student visas and had just stayed, and they were picking up the money. It would not surprise me at all to find that you've got the same thing with people from Cameroon in the United States opening up bank accounts and taking out the money. So you can find them, and I think Kathy's point was a good one. The other thing I know, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Illinois did a lot of mass marketing fraud cases, and initially one of the objections was, well, gee, we've only got 2 or 3 complaints, but of course these are huge scams and they're related. So and all the cases they did, there end up being, of course, millions of dollars being lost and thousands of victims. So they needed somebody there locally for venue, but something you can make some progress on this stuff. And I salute you for reaching out to the police and communicating that to them.
Yeah. Why don't we open it up now? I just want to, and you've got your, in the chat, we included the information on the peer-to-peer Zelle kinds of fraud. And I just want to reiterate what Bob already said. I think most important in this kind of case, besides, of course, the police, and I would say the Internet Crime Complaint Center and the FTC, would be reporting to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. They seem to be in the best position to at least be able to help in working with some of these kinds of things and hopefully getting a response to complaints that are filed, as well as to your state attorney general. And I did also include kind of Senator Warren's report on there. I went onto the Zelle website and I have what their recommendations are. That's included in there, and I'll let you go ahead and read that. And then several of the articles that Bob presented, and then an article that was given to me by Tom, who's on this call, a recent thing about the LA Times. And I think they got a lot of the same information from the New York Times in kind of, you use Zelle, here's how to spot increasingly common scams and what to do. So that's in our handouts. I think I'm going to start with, and feel free, you guys, to open up, you unmute yourself for this, because we really would like to have a discussion. Maggie, you had a question first, so do you want to go ahead and ask that in the group and unmute yourself and ask?
Hi, everyone. Of course. Thank you. So I guess I'm just curious, because banks have to file SAR reports if they if a victim calls saying that they've been fraud of this, do they have to file a SARS report on this? Is there any way, because that gets to law enforcement. So is there any way from that angle that anything's being done?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know the answer. My suspicion is that most of the cases they deflect so that there's no record of it. Someone calls up and says, my money's been stolen, suspicious activity report. So that's actually kind of a broader category than just fraud reports. I wrote a long piece about them many years ago. I think there's something on the order of 1 million SARs filed every year. It's an overwhelming amount of data. But at any
They are
rate, when someone-
supposed to be reporting on elder abuse, elder financial fraud or exploitation though, which is kind of interesting. So that
Yeah.
brings up a good point. But the other problem with, I think Maggie with that is, we're kind of doing a deep dive on that. Carol's on the call, but what we're learning is some of the banks, especially maybe the bigger ones, whereas credit unions and some smaller banks may be filing a SARS right away, so that it is like maybe a useful tool for law enforcement if they have a DCN number, a document control number. Some of the other banks are not getting SARS out for 30, 60 days. So it's basically useless as a law enforcement tool. But that is a good question on whether they have to do this on this kind of fraud.
So these are suspicious activity reports that the banks are required to file, go to law enforcement. They're totally not public. They can't be used in cases or prosecutions. But they do look at them, at least I know in the Eastern District of Missouri and St. Louis once a month. They pull all those out and there's a team of postal inspectors and FBI agents that go through all the ones that have been filed for their area. And sometimes there's details, and I would think they would help detail money mules. I know other people here on this call know more about it. Kathy Stokes says, don't bother submitting them.
And Steve, isn't for the most part that that's a tool used to look for large scale money laundering, right? Like I'm not familiar with SARS being used to track down consumer crimes.
That do not submit was to try to correct my earlier one where I was trying to say if the loss was due to an authorized transaction, it is my understanding that at least the larger financial institutions simply don't report those.
Okay.
They don't submit them.
Christine from Postal, I don't know if you're still on to know anything about this. Postal
I
inspector?
really probably would be able to speak about that right now.
Okay, maybe some we can look into further too, try to find out, you know, are these kind of, I think peer-to-peer, just in general, are peer-to-peer reportable, especially with Zelle where they've got supposedly the endorsement of the banks behind them. So good question came out of this. Are there other things that people, you don't have to start with the chat. You're welcome to just unmute yourself and ask away, especially we got Bob, our expert here.
Hey,
I've
Bob,
known him since the early identity theft days. He could talk about anything.
So Bob, so the people that claim there's a problem with your account, do they claim to be from the bank or do they claim to be from law enforcement or another federal agency?
So the most popular flavor of this at the moment is they call from the bank, although I have started to hear from people who get calls from someone saying there's a warrant for your arrest, that story. So all those cover stories sort of make their way around, but the calls from the bank are very, very effective. But let me give you one example. And since I have the floor and all of you listening for a moment, I want to give a very short speech I'm now taken to give. But first, let me give you an example of a kind of Zelle fraud that I would actually call a perfect scam. So a person gets a text message from Bank of America, well, it looks like it's from Bank of America, and it's this story: your account's been hacked, we need to help you, call us and we'll help you. This guy was smart and he said, I know, and I've seen on TV not to respond to those texts or call that number. So he pulls out his credit card, finds the right number for Bank of America, calls the real Bank of America, gets customer service, and the real Bank of America says, we're very busy right now, press 1 and we'll call you back in 20 minutes. So he does that. 3 minutes later, the criminal calls him, and the criminal is spoofing the number so it looks like it's Bank of America. So he has asked Bank of America to call him, and he gets a call back from someone saying, this is Bank of America. So
Wow.
at this point, this fellow has done everything correctly and then follows the instructions he's given. And then all his money is stolen from his bank account. And then he calls Bank of America and Bank of America won't help him. So that's just a terrible crime. And it's, you know, there's this tendency in every one of these stories for someone to say, well, hey, victim, why did you do this? Why did you do that? We want to blame the victim, because if we can blame the victim, then no one has any responsibility, and we can all just go about our days and not change anything, right? So this is a story where there is no blame the victim angle whatsoever. But as far as I'm concerned, it's also a story about what I now believe to be the largest vulnerability in banking and in most of cybersecurity, which is bad customer service. The actual hack there was of Bank of America's wait time. Like if the criminal provided better service than the bank. If the bank actually answered the phone and worked with consumers, there would be no angle for this crime. But instead, because there was a 20-minute queue and the criminal was able to jump that queue, That's why this crime occurred. And so in many cases, the answer that we just overlook because we've been sort of beaten down to accept it is there is terrible response from these companies. And that opens the door for so many of these crimes.
No, and a lot of them have customer service, even if they, and some of them, as somebody alluded to earlier, there is nobody.
No.
They don't have a call center at all.
Right,
And
right.
that's a major issue across the board. And then people go to the Better Business Bureau or wherever because they can't get a hold of the company. And then the company's like, gee, why are we got all these complaints with the Better Business Bureau? The other one that always made me crazy is you've got all these companies that are then doing market research to try to figure out what their customers think about them. And they're not paying attention to this free data that they're getting feedback from their own customer complaint centers.
Right. I love when a company hangs up on me or something like that and then sends me an email immediately saying, how was your experience with us?
I know Martinez, I don't know what your first name is, but you were starting to ask a question. Do you want to go ahead? Or discussion?
Yeah, it's kind of a comment. I work for San Mateo County APS and I do the financial aspect. And in the last maybe 3 or 4 weeks, I've been getting a lot of scams and they're all the same way. It's a text scam. They tell them that it's AT&T or or PG&E or any type of company. And then they tell them they're going to give them a refund for some reason. And then they tell them, go into your computer, do this and that. And then somehow they get access to the computer and then they tell them to type a number. Like, let's say they're going to get $500 back. And then somehow they tell them, oh, you made a mistake and now you wire yourself 50,000 instead of 500. And then they tell them, now you need to wire the money back to us, but we need you to keep confidentiality. When you go to the bank, we're going to give you this and that. So the clients go and they don't say anything to the bank, and they wire the money back to these people. And a lot of people are like, I just didn't want to owe anything to these companies, and they're being honest. I had a client yesterday, she lost $84,000. And the day before, 19,000. And they're always about the decimal mistake, that you made a mistake, now you owe us money. And I've been seeing them a lot. And I'm like, how do I tell these people not to send any money? I just want to say that.
One thing
really.
I
Go ahead.
know, I believe that what they're usually asking for is these are programs that are set up with two-factor authentication, and what they're usually asking to give up on their cell phone is their PIN number so that they can get access and kind of get control of that account. But Bob, go ahead. I just wanted to point that out, that's usually what's.
No, actually, I'm really glad that you brought that up. If you visit my website, which I would encourage some of you to do, I'm in the middle of a two-factor authentication nightmare right now. I won't belabor you with the details, but two-factor is really important. Consumers should use it, but there are all sorts of use cases where it falls apart. And the most common form of two-factor is this text message code that you get, an authorization code, usually 6 or 8 digits. Criminals are working around that right now. In sophisticated crimes, they can intercept the messages, but most of the time they find some cover story to get the consumer who receives the text message to divulge that so they can pass the second factor as they're logging into an account. But I think back to the main cover story that you're hearing from consumers about, that's just a terrible scam. And the reason it's enticing is, of course, who doesn't want money, right? So you call up and the person responds with, oh yeah, well, maybe I did overpay with my electric bill right now. Electric bills are really high right now, right? So I'm entitled to a refund, and that just gets them in the door. And once the conversation begins, the criminals are very good at manipulating the people further on down the line. The message that is the best thing to repeat just over and over and over again, when any unexpected phone call arrives, don't answer it. If you do actually answer it, say thank you very much, hang up, and then call the correct number for the company that you know independently. And as we kind of discussed in this call, I used to very flippantly say, Google the number yourself. Even that you can't really trust anymore. So it's best to look at a bill or But at any rate, the main headline message is any unexpected phone call, just hang up or don't take it.
Or text.
Or text, yeah.
Rebecca, let's hear from Dr. Goodman.
Hi,
Go ahead.
so I have several questions related to age and Zelle use. I'm just going to say all the questions straight in a row and then answer as you'd like. One is, do elders use Zelle? Like in what numbers do elders use Zelle? Second, does Zelle try to target different age groups, to use Zelle more? And third, because I have a 21-year-old daughter and all she does with her whole life, or her whole cash management thing is Venmo, it seems to me. Is that age group, not including my daughter, because I give her lectures all the time about this, but is that age group sophisticated about scams? Those are my questions.
Oh, those are all great questions. So I don't know internal demographics for Zelle, but I can give you a couple of tea leaves. An important thing to know about Zelle is that if you have a bank account at a major US bank, you have a Zelle account. You may not know that they've just automatically opened a Zelle account for you.
Did I miss?
And in fact, it's nearly impossible to close your Zelle account, which is a great vulnerability of theirs. That's how, again, it seems unbelievable when I relay the story, but that's how people have tens or 20,000s worth of money moved out of their bank accounts through Zelle, and they'd never even heard of Zelle. So the way that Zelle grabbed market share very quickly was that overnight, everyone with a Wells Fargo account, a Bank of America account, or whatever, had a Zelle account.
Okay.
And in fact, you might, not that long ago, you might remember there were ways at, say, USAA or Bank of America to direct pay people who had the same bank as you. They overnight turned those off and forced everyone into Zelle. So again, you have a Zelle account, even if you don't know you have a Zelle account. And so as a result, yes, elderly people use Zelle. If anytime you try to pay anybody, and of course, using what I call dark patterns online, you try to make any sort of a payment, they're going to steer you towards using Zelle because they really, really, really want market share. And that's because they were very scared about Venmo, et cetera. All the kids use Venmo. And that's why in the earliest iterations of Zelle ads, this is probably the best answer to your question. I mean, there was all sorts of rap music. They were obviously aimed at a very young and a very urban demographic at first. So that's the market they were most scared of losing, because that's the market that's going to have money in 10 years. So they suddenly realized their business was in big trouble. What was your second question? Oh, the sophistication of young people. I don't know. I mean, I hesitate to offer a grand opinion about that. The sort of trite answer is, well, younger people are better at this tech stuff, so of course they're hip to it. I don't know that I would say that's true. I do think, for the most part, young people, it makes sense to them to, instead of hand $10 or $20 bills back and forth to each other for lunch, that they just do this over apps. And I think that's fine. I think that this actually works really well. The larger problems come later when criminals figure out how to move larger amounts of money with it. I don't know why. I mean, to me, a really simple solution here is to cap these transactions at like $100, because I'll bet 99.987% of Zelle transactions are under $100, and it's hard to get in trouble at that level. And if they just made some huge speed bumps for larger transactions, I can't imagine it would really interfere with their business, and it would make it infinitely safer. But that's just my opinion.
Interesting. Yeah.
Especially in a 24-hour period or something, that you can only do 100 in a 24-hour period. All right, There's a couple people we missed. I want to make sure we get a question in. Kathy had a question about Stream. Kathy Burrows. Did you want to go ahead and ask that about Stream? I thought that was a good one, and kind of missed that one earlier.
Well, I don't know what Stream is, so please tell me what it is.
Is Kathy still on?
I'm sorry.
That's all right, Berwick. Yeah.
Stream is a new fraudster item that's not traceable. People can get it from Target. I got a lady that's down $7,500, and all she does is scratch the numbers off the back and give them to her person, and he gets the money from Stream. So
is it a stored value card, like a gift card, or?
Yeah, it's like a gift card, but it's called Stream and apparently it's not traceable. But I mean, I'm sure all the funds are going overseas, but
I think those, if I'm right, it seems to me those are a lot of what people use for gamers. And also that this is a pretty big deal in Canada. The Canadian Anti-Fraud Center particularly mentioned Steam cards as being one of the ways crooks were getting money.
Oh, Steam. I got it. Yeah, yeah.
And Anna Chandler, you seem to have some very important knowledge to kind of go back to the SARS. Do you want to go ahead and share what you were posting on the chat, and maybe we kind of go back to that a little bit? Anna?
Okay. I think you were explaining that there are financial levels, though, right? That beyond SARs aren't filed unless a certain dollar threshold is met. Yeah.
Yes, yes. And then Carol Sewell brought up that even if the SARS is filed, if there's no accompanying report to APS or law enforcement, that there may not be follow-up that actually especially benefits that victim. So I think, that's critical, that sometimes they are filing the SARS but not doing the others. So
now that I remember, the SARS system was wildly expanded after 9/11, right? With the post 9/11 anti-terrorism bill. And so I think the SARS system was essentially built with an eye towards finding terrorism funding and money laundering related to that. And so that's probably a good reason why we don't hear much about SARS and consumer fraud.
all right. Other questions? Just about in general on these kinds of things? Appreciate hearing from Ms. Martinez about kind of what she's getting a lot of.
Hey, Bob, do you think of people I went to a meeting of local bankers that deal with fraud things months and months ago, and they mentioned Zelle, and the bankers were saying, we can't figure out whether we need to give these people back the money or not. And maybe that was before they got the official word from on high, or maybe local banks are still trying to do right by the customers. But do you think it would make a sense for a customer to go to their local bank first instead of the official Bank of America site or something like that?
I don't know. I mean, it's always worth talking to a human being, right? I suppose. And the smaller the bank, maybe the better luck you'd have there. But it's hard to imagine that whoever that is wouldn't immediately send them to the fraud department, and then they would have to talk to a fraud investigator.
Okay.
I can just mention, I'm seeing cases with my work with some of the local APSs, some serious examples where people have had their life savings stolen in usually romance imposter frauds. And in some cases, the frauds continue because the scammers have access to their computers and the victims don't know it. And even though I'll say, please get it professionally cleaned and, go to your local Geek Squad, whatever, they can't do that because they can't afford it. So scammers are staying in there despite they run the antivirus, so they think they're all right, even though the computer's still running slow, et cetera, et cetera. But I've had just 3 horrific examples lately where the scammers then pretend to be them and have taken out needed funds that the victims don't have now. So they're actually facing eviction. But because the scammers later can get into those bank accounts and impersonate them, as well as putting them in as the trusted person for Social Security and all kinds of just horrible things. So I think one of my new pushes I'm going to be trying to do is work with local community colleges and maybe senior centers to see if we can get community colleges or universities, their IT departments, to perhaps be willing to clean computers for free for especially our older adults, the other chronic victims that are caught up in this kind of thing and can't afford it. So I'd love to see if you guys want to join me in this kind of effort, or, it's just, I got to make the right connections, or maybe even do it with, if you get a letter from APS or a letter from a senior center, or have it done at the senior center or somehow. But I think this is such a much needed gap in what we're now being able to do. And it has led to later frauds because these people can't protect themselves fully in the beginning. So I just wanted to mention that because it's really become a lesson that I'm seeing over and over again that I just don't know how to solve because I can't loan them the money to get the computer cleaned and I sure don't know how to do it myself. So I just wanted to bring that up, that seems to be an issue that I'm seeing, that a gap that maybe we could meet with, you know, given universities and other folks, high schools even.
You know, since I just had my cell phone stolen and I had to go through a lot of this rigmarole myself, as you're describing that situation, Debbie, it makes me think that there's a second problem, which is, so just because their computer is cleaned doesn't mean that their password for their bank account is now safe, right? And if you can picture a portfolio of other things that have to be cleaned, for lack of a better term, I'm going to say, that are in the cloud. And whatever you're thinking along those lines, it would be great if that program also included, okay, here's how to make sure that your password is appropriately changed at all these other places. And if the criminal is somehow stealing your text messages, that's been fixed, you know, because just, you know, wiping their computer and starting over only solves half the problem, right?
Right. And I tell them that and follow up afterwards. But again, without that computer being cleaned, it's, yeah.
Of course. Yeah.
And you want to also, you know, have them freeze their account, freeze their credit and all those kinds of things we kind of go over. But yeah.
It's a big checklist. It's a really big checklist. And it's getting bigger all the time. That's the other problem, you know.
And unfortunately, short-term programs often aren't as effective as they need to be because for many of these victims, it's a long road that they're on to kind of get out of this. So, but of course, that's another gap. Other questions or just comments or things? Again, this is kind of open chat, guys. I see a lot of the kind of mute on. You guys are welcome to talk, share on this.
Bob, is there anything else that you tend to get a lot of complaints from victims on reaching out to you?
Yeah, so it's actually, as long as I have all of your ears, I'd like to make a pitch to all of you. We do this weekly podcast for AARP Perfect Scam, and always looking for to more humanize the crimes. So if you have crimes that are particularly egregious or just a story that you really feel needs telling, you know, please email me. I'm bob@bobsullivan.net, or Steve can help you find me. I'm pretty easy to find. Usually the first Google link will work for me. But I would love to hear from anyone of other victim stories that you have. Actually, you know, I don't know if Kathy feels like she can talk about this, but one of the great resources that AARP has is this helpline. So Kathy, it's 70 or 80,000 calls a year, right? That the phone line is, go ahead.
More. Last year, we got 97,000 inbound calls.
That's just from, and every one of these are people who've suffered, well, not everyone, but most of them are people who've actually suffered a financial loss and have nowhere else to turn. So
yeah, there's a share who called to report, and we share that data with the Federal Trade Commission. There are a share who called saying, I don't know, is this really Publishers Clearinghouse? And then the rest have experienced fraud themselves, or a loved one has or is in the process. And what the helpline does, and you don't have to be an AARP member, you don't have to be of a certain age. You can call this number, and I'll put it in the chat, and you can get guidance from trained volunteers who will listen to you in a judgment-free zone, help you understand what happened, things that you can do. Boy, we wish we could say, you know, report this to your bank and they'll compensate you. We don't have any means of restitution for them, except in very minor cases. And but it's a really good resource. The average call time last year was over 20 minutes. So when you consider some of the calls are a minute long because they're reporting a scam, and then there are calls that go on over an hour to try to help this person. I'll put that number in the chat.
yeah, it's a really unique resource, and we see reports every week or so of the kinds of calls that are coming in. And it's funny. So for someone to ask me, what scams are you seeing right now? It's sort of an overwhelming question because I see hundreds of them. And if there was something that was completely new, that would pop into my head and I would share it with you. So many of these stories are just slight variations of all the very familiar themes. The romance scams just will not quit, you know, and there's just so many different ways that they can be compromised. But I do think these calls from fake computer security departments at financial institutions or at other places is the biggest, the most prevalent crime that's happening right now. It's very persuasive when someone calls and says, I'm from the bank. Yeah, and I'm here to help you. That's just seems to be working for the criminals right now. And if it weren't working, I wouldn't hear about so many of them.
Yes.
What was there was a comment that just went by. Somebody signed in a Wells Fargo. Could you?
Okay, I did. While you're doing this, I'm signing on to my Wells Fargo account. You can see it. I really honestly wasn't sure what Zelle was until today. And so you said that if you have a bank account, you have Zelle. And on the first page on this phone, who's using Zelle? Find the Zelle logo in your contacts, see the new features. Haven't clicked on it yet. But I'm so surprised to see that on the the first sign on page after I signed on.
Yeah.
Scary. That's all.
So everybody will be doing that at, in
Good.
5 minutes from now.
Yeah.
Good thing to review. I think the
Debbie, I
last thing
believe
is
someone has their hand up. Sorry,
Sure.
someone has their hand up.
Oh, that's me.
Miller, Steve?
Yeah, I'm Carolyn Miller. I'm in York County, Virginia. And this might be an oversimplification, but I can't help but wonder what responsibility banks have in really just all of these scams, because as time has gone by, they are pushing consumers to do all their transactions by text, all their transactions online. If you go into a bank branch now, there might be one teller. Sometimes we have seniors that are turned away. They want to do a face-to-face transaction and they're told, oh, well, you can do that online, or you can call this service number. And I know it's one thing to say, oh, well, you know, the face of finance or this industry is changing. And I know that we'll never go back to how things were, where you could walk into a bank and do face-to-face transactions. But, you know, they have pushed and driven all of the transaction traffic to the online platforms, to the text-based and app-based platforms. And these are the exact vehicles by which seniors are targeted and they fall prey. So where is the accountability to the banking industry for that? And I don't ask that just to, you know, arbitrarily blame them, but I can't help but feeling like they've created this in a sense.
Maybe we all need to call the Senate Subcommittee on Aging hotline number for fraud. And if they get, 61 people calling, whoever's on right now, and we talk about this as an issue, and we just want to have hearings about, you know, the financial industry's accountability in these kinds of things, I wonder if we can make something happen.
We do. I do have a contact also at the American Bankers Association, and they've got a foundation that's supposed to do consumer education that I suggested that they might want to put out a piece on Zelle frauds. And they didn't seem to take me up on it just at the time, but that might be another avenue for getting the attention of the bankers. The other thing is, I think, at least around St. Louis and I think other places, there are fraud groups of the bankers come to share information on what's going on. And if people could find out about those in those areas and attend those and let people know, because law enforcement goes to those too, that might be another way of sharing some of the concerns and what's going on. I think saw somebody just put out a note on, since there's not tellers anymore, it's harder to warn people about counterfeit checks being deposited. And that certainly is an issue. If you put them in through an ATM, you know, is nobody going to say, are you sure this is for real? And, you know, and so you're missing that chance to give people some advice and guidance.
Yeah,
Maybe we'll get-
Carol, is it Carol Miller? Is that your name, Carol?
Carolyn.
Carolyn, I'm sorry.
Carolyn, yeah.
I'm very, very glad you said this. This is the passionate issue that I'm all on fire about. That it's terrible customer service has essentially like moved all of these people out, left them to the wolves.
Right.
Like we've forced them all into this dangerous place. And then when something bad happens, we say, see, you should have known better. And it's such a logical consequence of what we've done. I mean, if I built a staircase out of plywood to my house and forced you to walk up the staircase and you fell through it and broke your arm, I'd be responsible.
It's kind of like the early law on the checks where the consumer activists back in the 1970s pushed to say, you know, you shouldn't have that long a waiting period if you're holding a check as a bank. And so they made these laws that banks have to kind of make the funds available, even though the check hasn't really cleared. And the frauds that came as a result of, you know, that good intention on that act. It's
Well,
difficult.
we've been going for an hour. Bob says it's a beautiful day in New York City and he's anxious to get outside and enjoy the weather. And boy, we really appreciate it, Bob. Thank you. That was really great.
Yeah,
Good
thank you
activity.
guys so much, really.
Yeah, you're most welcome. And again, I really appreciate all the work that you do. You know, keep the faith. I know sometimes it's hard, but it's really important.
And just to follow up, if you guys have topics or good ideas for speakers or different frauds or scams that you want us to cover for these monthly calls, let us know. Our November meeting is actually going to be a week early. Let's see if I can come up with the date. There is no meeting in December, but we are going to be meeting on November 17th, assuming that none of you would want to be here on Thanksgiving. So we'll see you on November 17th. And again, no meeting in December, but no forum in December. So thank you very much for
Could
participating.
you just paste my email address in the chat, Debbie? Would you do that?
Sure. You said Bob Sullivan at Bob
That's
Sullivan.
Bob@bobsullivan.net.
Bob at bobsullivan.net. Gotcha. And they should be able to get you through the links on the chat page I have.
All
too.
that too. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Can you guys stay on, Steve? And
Sure.